Allora scusate, ricominciamo visto che siamo un po' in ritardo e quindi invito i relatori Giovanna, Damia, e Antonio e Sara. Dove sono? Ok. I relatori che stanno siamo tutti nei relatori. Ah, ti senti? Sì.
No.
È una cosa però molto rapida perché no, così abbiamo, non dobbiamo salire e scendere. E Sara, come bist tu? Dove sei? Ok. Vuoi parlare da Sara? Ok. Sì. Allora, visto che siamo molto in ritardo, io prego tra il pubblico se ci sono domande, una o due domande, risposte molto brevi e poi possiamo proseguire la discussione domani pomeriggio, direi. Allora, sì, Giulia, scusami, vuoi chiedere qualcosa? Vieni qui? Sì, perché...
Due domande e osservazioni per Antonio Broccoleri. Mi ha interessato moltissimo il suo intervento, anche perché io mi sono occupata molto di Peruzzi, quindi è stato molto nominato. La prima è se su questo grande peso dato proprio a Peruzzi Antonio da Sangallo giovane nel progetto di Lertarugli non ha influito anche il fatto che sono gli unici due di cui abbiamo centinaia di disegni, cioè se hai analizzato, se puoi dire qualcosa in più su questo. E poi l'altra domanda era ovviamente l'importanza del rilievo, hai parlato di Giovannoni e poi dopo scuola romana e Bruschi, ma volevo chiederti se puoi dire qualcosa di più su dei riferimenti diretti di Giovannoni alle Tarugli, cioè non ho capito bene se era un discorso generale sull'approccio al rilievo dell'École des Beaux-Arts o proprio un'attenzione specifica sulle Tarugli. Grazie.
Sì, allora la prima risposta comunque alla tua prima domanda effettivamente è legato a un discorso quantitativo e cosa che evidentemente lo spazio di Peter non permette di dire. Lui parte con i rilievi, cominciano i fascicoli con le tavole e poi progressivamente cominciando a nutrire i testi a commento delle tavole e continuando ad affinare, tornando o inviando i suoi emissari in situ per appunto verificare i rilievi, inizia a confrontarsi anche con questa questione dei documenti grafici e in particolare parte tutto non a caso con i disegni di Antonio da Sangallo, giovane, e poi Peruzzi. Penso che da una parte siano appunto questi inventari, non a caso li ho citati perché tutto l'insieme dei volumi che sono mi pare 7 o 8 dal 207 al 212 mi pare la nominazione, anzi 205 212 sono tutti, come dire, schedati da questo nuovo catalogo che Antonio Ramirez da Montalvo impulsa, fa realizzare appunto da Luigi Scotti, e a partire da lì quindi effettivamente i calchi soprattutto riguardano i disegni di Antonio, il giovane, Peruzzi e poi Giovanni Antonio Dosio, appunto, perché effettivamente anche di quello c'è un bel corpus di disegni. Per quanto riguarda invece la tua... Sì, come d'altra parte per esempio quello che ho mostrato di Palazzo Massimo alle colonne, se non vado errato, e dei calchi. E la seconda domanda, no, è un riferimento esplicito, quello di Giovannoni, da una parte non ammesso ma evidente fin dalla fine negli anni 90 dell'Ottocento, a causa di quello che vi ho mostrato, la porta del Palazzo Simonetti, che è proprio, voglio dire, lampante, diciamo, questa attenzione anche attraverso l'associazione da di attenzione proprio a questo corpus di rilievi. E d'altra parte affermata, non so nemmeno, non si può dire a posteriori, affermata più tardi, alla fine degli anni 30, quel brano che citavo relativo appunto al fatto di costituire degli archivi documentari ma anche degli archivi di rilievi, gli cita esplicitamente il lavoro di 30 anni di Paul-Marie Letardi, i suoi addentellati anche con i rilevatori e i disegnatori che l'hanno aiutato a Roma.
Please, one question for Giovanna Damia. You mentioned several publications on Bramante of those decades. It would be interesting if in these books, if there is a certain concept of style, of if the authors mention some equivalent for Renaissance in Italian, for example, or some other system of concepts, or is it only to write about the special architect, about his works, his buildings, without such a stylistic level?
Ma sulle pubblicazioni milanesi? Perché allora le pubblicazioni milanesi non arrivano non approdano poi a un testo storiografico compiuto, anche se ci sono tanti tentativi. E lì, se ho ben capito la domanda, la questione della definizione dello stile se lo pongono, cioè cercano proprio di trovargli una definizione, e anche quella che chiamavamo prima grammatica degli ornamenti. Più difficile risulta farlo a livello nazionale forse, perché poi il bramante milanese si ritaglia in quel momento, è quello un po' che cercavo di dire io, una nicchia che è anche strumentale alla cultura milanese di quel momento, per cui fare la stessa operazione su tutto Bramante ci prova Pungileone, ma non si pone la questione dello stile. Pungileone non si pone la questione dello stile, ma forse proprio perché ha anche una complessità in più, quindi il caso milanese è proprio una nicchia. E era interessante per queste connessioni con l'identità e con poi uno stile che nel momento in cui è codificato è anche disponibile a essere rivisitato progettualmente.
Posso fare una piccola considerazione poi cosa Sara? È che proprio Giovannoni lavorava su Bramante nella facoltà di ingegneria, proprio a cavallo tra la prima guerra mondiale e dopo, faceva fare delle esercitazioni dove per esempio Cesare Valle, molti Morati avevano proprio lavorato su Bramante, quindi era molto interessante, e invece le cose anticipano molto, però continuano a lavorare su questo con un'ottica anche da studenti di ingegneria, che poi quindi guardavano anche un po' alla costruzione anche, diciamo, dei progetti milanesi. Infatti poi si avrà da sede, adesso non abbiamo molto tempo, però potrebbe essere interessante il bramantismo come continua poi attraverso i 2 secoli. Faccio io una domanda a te. Make a question, which is the rule of maestranza of the scene in alcuni, diciamo, degli esempi che hai mostrato della fine del Cinquecento, tipo Domenico Redario, di Grazia
Vuoi dire il ruolo nel Cinquecento o
alla fine del
Cinquecento? Alla fine del Cinquecento?
Nei quartieri, se sono loro, se invece sono maestranze locali.
Sì, no, i maestranzi, i maestri di Ticino, di Lombardia, si sono dappertutto in Europa centrale, generalmente non è un regola festa, nelle zone cattoliche, quindi nel Sud Deutschland e Polonia, Boemia, eccetera. Li lavorano tantissimo, si fanno quasi tutto, ci sono architetti grandi di palazzi, ci sono anche Handwerker, craftsmen, sì, capomastri, lavoratori, artisti di sviluppo ovviamente, ma si sono veramente dappertutto, e la domanda per me è cosa effetto avevano sulla cultura locale e cosa effetto ha la cultura locale su loro, perché è veramente uno scambio sono famosi per l'abilità di lavoro in questo stile o quello stile, anche nel gotico, anche nello stile olandese, grazie. Quindi è veramente una domanda per noi oggi. E per me questa domanda è fatta più difficile perché la storia della storia di questa zona è tutto fatto con queste domande dello stile nazione. Quindi loro parlano italiano, ovviamente lavorano nello stile rinascimentale. Non l'hanno fatto, ma sono difficili di interpretare con questo framework e quindi voglio fare qualcosa per distruggerlo un pochino e poi forse possiamo capire cosa hanno fatto veramente.
Va bene, se non ci sono altre domande io direi che rimandiamo. C'è ancora una domanda, prego.
If I may, first of all, I would like to congratulate everyone on very stimulating papers, but I have a question for Sarah. And the question is, you've shown us examples from Bohemia, Silesia, Austria, Germany, and you have used this overarching term of German. I really think it's the term that you need to deconstruct before really progressing further in this discussion. Germany, as you said yourself, was only reunified, or rather unified in 1781. And whatever happens, 1871, sorry, I'm trying to say, and whatever happens before is really very much driven by regional agendas. Terms such as the Renaissance, variety of local varieties of this sort of Renaissance architecture are abandoned. So have you considered that tension between the term of German that you use and the 19th century realities?
Yes, it's very complicated. I admit that I use the term German and Germany quite loosely today. And I go back and forth between, typically when I've worked on this material, I've worked more broadly across the region and addressed examples of scholarship also from Bohemia and Hungary as well as Germany. So I've spoken rather freely of Central Europe as a whole, which is, I would say, more reflective of the political and cultural reality of the region. But today I was really quite interested in focusing on the scholarship on this material after the unification of Germany, so after Luca. And so I sort of stuck with the term German, although you're right, it's a very problematic term in the sense all of these authors, I mean, there is like a new nation of Germany with defined political borders for the first time, but all of these authors, you know, start their discussion, for example, with the Summer Palace in Prague, and they do bring in these examples that are sort of, they consider like part of the Germanic world, Germanic, yeah, which they consider part of the Germanic world and like legitimate subjects for their study of Germanness in architecture, although you know, their Czech contemporaries disagree strongly, obviously.
So is the language the kind of framework?
Yeah, and I haven't, I'm still quite early in my research on this topic, and I haven't really settled on a good way to discuss what is German or Germanic, depending on, you know, if I'm discussing writing before 1871 or after 1871, should I use the same terms? In a broader study where I'm bringing in examples from other scholarship from other national perspectives, how should I use the term German? You know, especially when you're getting into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, like what is German? It's incredibly difficult. I would welcome any insights and thoughts you might have on this question. I sort of kept it kind of loose today, but you're right. It's a very complicated question.
Credo che sia una discussione su cui possiamo continuare a chiacchierare, che anche il mondo della costruzione, dell'intorno, delle scialbature, c'è un mix, secondo me nel nord della Germania uniscono tante cose. Stop, finiamo così, e grazie a tutti e rimaniamo alla prossima sessione. Prego.
che dovremmo terminare oggi alle 6:30, dunque fra un'ora. Io non vorrei ritardare questo e così comincio di presentare già la Ute Engel, la collega Ute Engel, che è professoressa di storia dell'arte all'Istituto di Halle in Germania e ha soprattutto lavorato sopra l'architettura gotica in Inghilterra, una tesi di laurea sopra la cattedrale di Worcester e poi ha presentato il suo Opus Magnus che si chiama Stil und Nation, Barockforschung und deutsche Kunstgeschichte, circa 1830 bis 1933, Stile e Nazione, ricerca sul barocco in Germania e penso che tu vai a continuare adesso con questo soggetto. Prego.
Yes, thank you very much, Bruno, for this short and to the point introduction brought to the point, which we do need because of the time. Is it? It's on already, is it? Yes, very good. And of course, thank you to Sabine, Frommel and Henrik Karge for organizing this fantastic, inspiring conference. I'm trying to find my own. Oh, so all the names have been shifted around. I'm sorry, I have to find myself here. Ah, there we are. This does look very strange. No, it's not the right one. Could someone of the organizers perhaps help me? Ah, there we are. There we are. Next slide. It works. Okay. Right. Yes. As you have just heard, I wrote this very substantial book of about 800 pages on the question of style and the nation. In the case studying the historiography of the Baroque in Germany, and of course I've tackled exactly the same questions we've just addressed, and which Sarah Lynch has been addressing. And of course the term Germany is problematic, and I dealt with in the introduction of the book the way the attitudes towards Germany have changed, of course. And sort of starting from this question of language, so the connection between language, and this does bring me to my lecture today, because it is partly about language and the impact of language in the forming of the notion of the Baroque. So my research has fostered on two questions. One has been how is the notion of what Baroque is informed in this whole debate between about 1830 and 1933, and how have the ideas of a specific Germanness in this Baroque art have been formed. But today I'm not going to talk about these national issues. We've heard about this quite a lot, but I'm going to talk about the more general notions towards the Baroque in the writings of Cornelius Gurlitt, Heinrich Wölflin, and August Schmarzo. And you can see in the title, and I've put the dates of the publications in the title. In fact, we also tend to focus on Wölflin, but of course, a year before Wölflin, an important book by Cornelius Gurlitt was published. I'm just thinking that there's a misspelling there, it's only one L in his name. Sorry for this. Heinrich Wölflin followed, so that was 1887. Heinrich Wölflin followed the year afterwards, 1888, and then about 10 years later, August Schmarzo. And I'm going to include, also another language into our discourse, because I'm going to treat you with a couple of German quotations out of these books, and because of the time, I'm not going to translate all these quotations into English, because I'm assuming that most of you can sort of grasp the content of the German quotations, and secondly, because I'm convinced that language is important and the way language is used, especially with these sort of great fathers of art history who obviously dealt very contentiously with language. You can see the way they write about art. They wrote about art. So I'm starting with famously Heinrich Wölflin claimed in his epoch-making Habilitationsschrift Renaissance und Barock, eine Untersuchung über Wesen und Entstehung des Barockstils in Italien. And you can see the title page on the right-hand side, so Renaissance and Baroque, research about the Wesen, which is again very difficult to translate, so the notion and the development of the Baroque style in Italy, published in 1888. Man täte vielleicht nicht unrecht, überhaupt nur von einem römischen Barock zu sprechen, and you can see the quotation here on the front. The double negation in this sentence is difficult to translate, so you could translate it as perhaps one could assume to talk about a Roman Baroque only. So, only in Rome, Wölfling explained, the transformation of the Renaissance into the Baroque, the Stilwandel, so the change of style, took place in a typified way, codified way, and Wölfling highlights three aspects of this especially Roman transformation. First, Renaissance architecture here in Rome, and because we are on the spot, in the Rome of Bramante, and I think it's very interesting that he highlights Rome, the city of Bramante, and we've just heard that, of course, Bramante can be associated with a number of Italian cities, but for Wölfling it was Rome. So in the Rome of Bramante can be observed the Renaissance architecture in its most purified stylistic appearance, culminating in what Wölfling called strenge form, a severe form. Wölfling primarily was interested in the process of the dissolution of this severe Renaissance form, of its mutation into the Baroque, the forms of which he to the contrary, characterized as moved, spacious, solid, even as formless, or entarted. Wölfling uses this sort of very sort of contaminated term, entarted, degenerate. In Wölfling's view, this transformation from the Renaissance into the Baroque was not a slow process, but a sudden shift carried through consciously in Rome especially. His second point, following Wölfling, is that the Baroque appeared for the first time in Rome, emanating here out of the high blossoming of the Renaissance and turning directly into the opposite stylistic direction, a substantially new formal appearance, etwas wesentlich Neues, a style without precedence, ohne Vorbilder, the Baroque. Wölfling's third point concerns the time frame of his exploration, which he designed more like a scientific experiment of thought than an art historical narrative. He declared only to deal with the time span between 1520 to 1630, even narrower to 1580. During this period, he claimed that the new style of the Baroque was accomplished to a finished state in Rome, and the new style, and Wölfling did not accept any intermediate period for this transformation, for this mutation. No spät Renaissance, no late Renaissance, no early Baroque, früh Baroque. Thus, Wölfling is not interested in a history of artistic evolution, of stylistic development. To the contrary, he aimed at picking out the symptoms which characterized, formated these two opposing stylistic entities and their psychological effects. And there's this very famous page of in Renaissance and Baroque, where he contrasts these two styles. I hope you can, not really sharp, but I'm not going to quote the full passages, but the chapter 2 starts with this sentence, the important sort of opening sentence, die Renaissance ist die Kunst des schönen, ruhigen Seins. Sie bietet uns jene befreiende Schönheit, die wir als ein allgemeines Wohlgefühl und gleichmäßige Steigerung unserer Lebenskraft empfinden. And so on. To the contrary, der Barock beabsichtigt eine andere Wirkung. Er will packen mit der Gewalt des Affekts, unmittelbar überwältigend. And so on. So, summing up these important passages, Wölfling characterizes the Renaissance as the art of contention, rest, peace, freedom, beauty, balance, and vitality. He uses Lebenskraft. The Baroque, to the contrary, as the art of affectation, forcefulness, agitation, restlessness, tension, even ecstasy and frenzy. In the rigidity of his formal and psychological
psychologically semanticized opposition between Renaissance and Baroque, Wölflin's position of 1888 seems to be a fairly radical and forceful one, especially as he did not illuminate his propositions by the analysis of definite objects. Wölflin argued deductively and confronted his readers with his abstract conclusions. The few illustrations included into the main part of his book on Stilwandel are line drawings reduced to single elements contrasted with each other, like the balustrades designed by Raphael or Giacomo della Porta on the one side of the screen and commented by Wölflin as Renaissance, a balustrade composed by two separate parts, and I'm sure you can see what I mean on the right-hand side, and the Baroque balustrade, a balustrade designed as an integrated body, ein einheitlicher Körper. Or schematic diagrams which Wölflin named as a diagram of ein Schema eines Renaissance-Pfeilers, a Renaissance pier, and Schema eines Baroque-Pfeilers, a Baroque pier, commented on as the Renaissance pier, a slender pier constructed by 4 single pilasters, and a Baroque pier is transformed into a bulky shaped mass, das Barockmassige, and this Barockmassige, the mass which looks out at the edges between the pilasters and sort of diagonally shaped edges. Monuments and Roman monuments solely only figure in the final part of Wölflin's book, Die Entstehung der Typen, but even there, buildings are divided up into separate entities like plans and facades, walls and articulations, windows and portals. Like the facade of Santa Susanna in Rome by Carlo Maderna, illustrated by a black and white frontal photographic reproduction accompanied by Wölflin's explanation, and I'm quoting, ein Werk von prächtigem Kraftgefühl, so the topic of the feeling and sort of forceful feeling in architecture again, ein Werk von prächtigem Kraftgefühl, der Reichtum entladet sich im Aufwärtsdrängen, höchst energische Betonung des Vertikalstrebens. But Wölflin was not the first German art historian who occupied himself with the Baroque and its architecture, although from inside he was one of the most influential ones. And so I would now like to deal with at least 2 of his contemporaries in order to contextualize Wölflin's position and sort of in a sort of restricted way in this lecture. As is well known, the historiography of the Baroque is a complex one, and Wölflin's teacher Jakob Burckhardt played a decisive role in the re-evaluation of the Baroque, away from its condemnation as willful, overloaded, distorted, a term characterizing a bad taste, to its acceptance as a neutral, descriptive, stylistic term. Beginning with Burckhardt's Cicerone, and we've heard even with Franz Kugler today of 1855 or even the 1840s, this re-evaluation of the Baroque became a central preoccupation of German language, art and architectural historiography, especially during the emergence of art history of one of the leading Geisteswissenschaften, humanities, during the German Kaiserreich of the 1870s to 1890s. One of the outcomes of this newly established art and architectural history in Germany were the series of monumental handbooks published in the 1880s, where the topics of Renaissance and Baroque architecture figured prominently. Highly influential were the 3 volumes Geschichte des Barockstiles, des Rokoko und des Klassizismus, edited by Cornelius Gurlitt in 1887 to 1889. They belong to the handbook Geschichte der Baukunst, initiated by Franz Kugler, Jakob Burckhardt and Wilhelm Lübke in the 1850s to 60s. The first volume of Gurlitt's trilogy was dedicated to Italy. This is the volume of 1887, with which I'm going to deal shortly, and only this is dealing with the Roman monuments again. The second volume of Gurlitt was dedicated to Belgium, Holland, France and England, published in 1888, and the third to Germany, published in 1889. Gurlitt styled himself as a discoverer of the Baroque, which he was not, and claimed that there had been hardly any studies on the topic before. He therefore personally visited most of the buildings analyzed in the 3 volumes himself, described them and made drawings of them on site, later used in his books. Goethe's extensive travels around Europe were organized by train, which becomes evident in the choice of monuments covered by him. They were all easily accessible by train stations and by long walks through the major cities. Rural building, to the contrary, rarely came to the notice of Gurlitt. Gurlitt was trained as an architect, contrary to Wölfling, who had studied philosophy, because of course art history in this time was not sort of a separate university subject, or only started to emerge as one. And I'm quite sure that Wölfling mainly, or even only visited Rome, contrary to Gurlitt, to travel widely through Italy. With this different approach as architect and architectural historian, Gurlitt was interested in the documentation and analysis of a large amount of single monuments, and he declared the comparison between them as his major methodological tool. The way Gurlitt used his comparisons between Spätrenaissance, the term he consciously used, and Baroque, immediately becomes clear in the layout of his book, especially in his treatment on the monuments of Rome. Gurlitt included wood engravings, mostly after his own drawings, into his text, and in this way the reader can easily follow his descriptions very differently from the way Wölfling works. On the first pages of Gurlitt's book, he exemplifies his use of the stylistic terms, late Renaissance and Baroque, by the illustration of characteristic monuments. So the court of Palazzo Borghese, as an example of late Renaissance, explained as der vorherrschenden, nur willkürlich durchbrochenen klassischen Wege, so it's all about classical rules. And Palazzo Madama and the facade of Santa Susanna as a typical for the Baroque. And interestingly, it was Gurlitt who first chose this facade of Santa Susanna in his work, and even Wölfling a year later, followed Gurlitt. Gurlitt defined the Baroque as, so this is the comparison between the 2 ways the facade of Santa Susanna is illustrated, and could go for a long time about this, but I'm going to not to do here. So Gurlitt defines the Baroque as, and you can see the quotation here, den Stil, der von antikisierender Basis ausgehend und bewusst freie, modern, vielgestaltige Behandlung des Baugedankens wie des Details zu einer gesteigerten, am Schluss bis zur Tollheit übertriebenen Ausdrucksform führte. Thus, Gurlitt worked with the contrast between Renaissance and Baroque. As well, he treated the 2 styles as thesis and antithesis, but he also was interested in the development of architectural history. Gurlitt argued that this development from Renaissance to Baroque was driven forward by the contrasting characters of the leading artists of the time, by a Kampf der Geister, a fight between artistic spirits of single individuals. And these 2 individuals, which he especially highlights, are Michelangelo and Palladio. And these he declared as the sort of leading, contrasting figures dominating this process of development from late Renaissance into the Baroque. Gurlitt explained their opposition, Michelangelo versus Palladio, or the other way around, in the tradition of the antinomy between classicism and anti-classicism, firmly rooted in early modern art theory. In this way, Palladio represented the adherence to artistic laws based on antiquity. Michelangelo, to the contrast, was the Titane des individuellen Wollens, the titan of individuality and willfulness. Quotation of Gurlitt hier, der Kampf und Rang eines heftig bewegten, großwollenden Gemütes, so this is Michelangelo, dort, Palladio, die Ruhe einer in sich und in ihrem Ideal klaren Seele, end of quote. Michelangelo, in this way, was declared to be the father of the Baroque, which is sort of a classical topic, fulfilled by later masters like Carlo Maderna, Bernini, Borromini, Pietro da Cortona, Guarini, whom Gurlitt dedicated single chapters in his book. Interestingly, Gurlitt's sympathies were clearly divided in this struggle between the individuality or the lawfulness of artistic creation. To Gurlitt, Michelangelo and with him the Baroque not only was the style of individuality and fantasy, but also of modernity. Gurlitt challenges his readers to recognize the artistic qualities of the Baroque with their modern eyes, das modern gebildete Auge, and to realize the energy, the power of Baroque architecture. And this is another quotation of Gurlitt. Alle Glieder sind mächtig und voller Saft und Kraft, aber das Geschick Kräftige schafft hier, wirkungsvolle Reflexe dort und überall ein rhythmisches Spiel der Massen zu schaffen. Die Kunst mittels großer Linien weite Fronten zu beherrschen und die Kraft an bevorzugten Punkten zur höchsten Entfaltung zu steigern, das Modellieren der Fassaden und Wandflächen in ihrem wirkungsvollen Relief hat keine Zeit besser verstanden als die des Barock. So Gurlitt treated architecture like a living body in an organic way, and we have heard about the sort of organicism in architecture today already. So architectural features are treated like limbs, Glieder, Gliedmaßen, moved by an inner force, and Gurlitt finally highlighted the Baroque as an athletic art, eine athletische Kunst, so this is the quotation at the title of my lecture. Clearly, Gurlitt was fascinated by the artistic freedom of the Baroque masters, by the carelessness with which they broke the inherited rules of classical antiquity, by their inspired and audacious solutions to complex spatial problems, geistreiche Lösungen like Bournes, San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane, or the richness and inventiveness of their architectural articulations like the facade of Santa Maria in Capitelli, and these are illustrations painted by Gurlitt. Interestingly, Gurlitt appreciated these qualities mainly on the exterior of Baroque architecture. The interiors obviously posed more problems to him. He recognized the Gesamteffekt, the overall effect, the artistic integration of the various arts, architecture, painting, sculpture, decoration, the richness of color, material, and detail, but he rarely illustrated one of those interiors, like the choir of San Ignazio. Yet these interior means only resulted for him in the effect of pomp, magnificence, and splendor, aimed at an overpowering overwhelming of the viewer. So Gurlitt's attitude towards the Baroque, the buildings of the Roman Catholic Church especially, still was ambivalent and formed by his Protestantism and the Kulturkampf between Protestants and Roman Catholics in the German Kaiserreich of his days. He admired the Baroque as an athletic art, but feared its tendency towards frenzy and agitation. Comparing Gurlitt and Wölfling, it has become clear that they both operated with similar measures, the strong contrast between Renaissance and Baroque, and with similar vocabulary in order to characterize these two styles, especially for movement, willfulness, the breaking of artistic laws, even frenzy and craziness, Tollheit, and delirium, Rausch, this is a term that they both use. Gurlitt was fascinated by the Baroque, but Wölfling, in my interpretation, was irritated to a certain degree, even afraid of the Baroque and its capacity to overpower the viewer, to transfer him into a state where he loses his self-control, where he is can be driven into an ecstatic experience. And these are some quotations out of Wölfling, coming back to Wölfling's Renaissance and Baroque. Man fühlt sich nicht erlöst, sondern in die Spannung eines leidenschaftlichen Zustands hineingezogen. In unermesslichen Räumen verliert sich Blick und Gedanke. Es ist eine Art von Berauschung, Delirium, mit der die Barockarchitektur den Sinn erfüllt. Eine dumpfe Totalempfindung. Man kann das Objekt nicht fassen. Formlos möchte man sich hingeben an das Unendliche. Besides these psychological effects, both Gurlitt and Wölfling used metaphors of bodily experience in order to characterize the Baroque. Gurlitt, with his notion of the Baroque as a power incorporated within the building, bringing its elements like the limbs of a body into movement, the Baroque as an athletic art. Wölfling, too, recognizes the movement of the Baroque Baukörper, the building as body, the swinging, the vibration of mural masses, culminating in the characterization of the Roman Baroque as herculic, herkulisch. And this is another sort of fairly famous quotation of Wölflins Renaissance und Barock. Das römische barocke Ideal von Körperlichkeit lässt sich so beschreiben. Anstelle der schlanken und gelenkigen Gestalten der Renaissance treten vollmassige Körper, groß, schwer, beweglich, von schwellender Muskelbildung und rauschender Gewandung in das Herkulische. Isolated, this is a strange passage. Wölflin talks about what? Bodies, corporality, figures, sculptures, or architecture. He himself gave the clue to his approach, in fact to his methodology in the passage above. Again a quote from Wölflin. Die prinzipielle Bedeutung aber dieser Reduktion der Stilformen auf die menschliche Gestalt beruht darin, dass hier der unmittelbare Ausdruck eines Seelischen vorliegt. End of quote. So it becomes clear that Wölflin here looks at stylistic forms, architectural forms, as a kind of double mirroring process. First as a mirror of human body, menschliche Gestalt, and Gestalt of course is a very sort of complex term in German philosophy of the time, and in the second sort of step, as an expression of an inner force of spirituality, das Seelische. Wölflin here related to the philosophy of his day, to the leading direction of Einfühlungsästhetik, which of course is well known, which he had studied and extended into his own methodology of the psychology of architecture in his dissertation already, Prolegomena zu einer Psychologie der Architektur of 1886, 2 years before he published this book here. In fact, Wölflin's book Renaissance and Baroque of 1888 can be explained as an application of his methodology to a kind of test case, the differentiation between Renaissance and Baroque architecture. Theoretically, Wölflin followed the idea that man, as a species, is capable to transfer his bodily personal experience towards physical forms, exterior of himself, including architecture, by a kind of spiritual, psychological, sympathetic operation called Einführung. And this is one quote from Prolegomena. Körperliche Formen können charakteristisch sein nur dadurch, dass wir selbst einen Körper besitzen. Als Menschen aber mit einem Leibe, der uns kennen lehrt, was Schwere, Kontraktion, Kraft und so weiter ist, sammeln wir an uns die Erfahrungen, die uns erst die Zustände fremder Gestalten mitzuempfinden befähigen. End of quote. Wölflin termed his methodology as an architectural physiognomics, architektonische Physiognomik, applicable to the human past too, and this is an important step he is making. Another quotation of Wölflin, ein architektonischer Stil gibt die Haltung und Bewegung der Menschen seiner Zeit wieder. So, this is a central argument for Wölflin. He interconnected the bodily experience of the viewer as the subject with his capacity to perceive and to distinguish the bodily experience as expressed in a historical style, as incorporated within the form of an object. In this way, Wölflin constructed a bridge not only between subject and object, but also between past and present. The present viewer and the men of the past who created an object like architecture can communicate with each other on their common yet historically formed bodily experience. By the transfer of this bodily experience to the object, a Formkraft, a formal power, is created, which in turn operates within the object and produces the capacity to bring a building into movement. So Wölflin arrived at an organological, anthropomorphic attitude towards architecture comparable to Gaulle, but stemming from a different methodological angle. Wölflin concluded, quote, form is Tat, end of quote, form is action. Further developing a sentence of Friedrich Theodor Fischer, one of the leading philosophers of Einfühlungsästhetik, who said, das Schöne ist nicht ein Ding, sondern ein Akt, Beauty is not a thing, but an act in 1866. Wölflin's physiognomy and psychology of architecture initiated the whole debate about the analysis of form, centers especially around the questions of Renaissance and Baroque architecture and German art historiography between the 1880s and around 1900. And one of the fiercest participants of this debate and opponents to Wölflin was August Schmarso, to whom I'm going to come to the final few minutes of my lecture. Schmarso is famous for introducing the category of space into the architectural discourse in his two influential lectures on das Wesen der architektonischen Schöpfung of 1894 and über den Wert der Dimensionen im menschlichen Raumgebilde of 1896. Less studied are the three monumental volumes of Schmarso, Beiträge zur Ästhetik der bildenden Künste, published 1896 to 99. I would finally like to highlight only one aspect of the sort of very complex methodology of Schmarso, with which I've dealt extensively in my book. So only one aspect of the second volume, Baroque and Rococo, eine kritische Auseinandersetzung über das Malerische in der Architektur of 1897. And this is a book without any illustrations, so this is the other extreme. In this book, Schmarso unfolds a very different view of the relationship between Renaissance and Baroque than Wölflin and Coleridge. Schmarso opposed to Wölflin's notion of a dialectical process between contrasting symptoms of artistic principles in art history. Instead, he pleaded for a genetic development from the Renaissance to the Baroque. Michelangelo is again declared as the father as the Baroque, especially with his central work of St. Peter's. And both Michelangelo's work, especially St. Peter's, the eastern part of the cupola, and the Baroque as a whole are explained by Schmarso as a style of plasticity, ein plastischer Stil. Schmarso too appreciated a force working within the architectural forms of the Baroque, but for him this is not an abstract power created by Einfühlung, but it is the Bildnergeist, the spiritual force of the individual artist who created, modeled the architectural object, transforming the material mass into a composition at large, a composition im Großen. This composition, following Schmarso, can only be interpreted by the analysis of the interconnection between its single elements built together in order to form this whole. Following up this path of inquiry, Schmarso in fact is the first to transfer the idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk to the Baroque, arriving at a positive attitude towards Baroque interiors, to the contrary to Wölflin and Gurlitt. But Schmarso turned towards a positive evaluation of the interplay of architecture, painting, and sculpture, analyzing an example, several examples, especially the Galleria Farnese of the Karge. This is a short last quotation. Die farbige Dekoration des Gesamtkunstwerks, so here's the term, in 1897, besonders im Innenraum, wo Gemälde, Reliefs, Statuen, die tektonische Formen und Flächen in sich vereinigt und auch mit allen diesen integrierenden Bestandteilen als einheitliches Gebilde gedacht sein dürfte. So Schmarso is a master of forming extremely complicated and very long sentences. So it's one of the reasons why he's rarely read, because he's so complicated. But it's a fine endeavor, for he's full of insights, in fact, very original thinker. So finally, Schmarso, and now I'm coming to the end, offered a further sort of code sentence summarizing the Baroque and its power. Schmarso says, Schönheit ist Kraft, beauty is power. So in this way, the line between Wölflin's form ist Tat, to Gurlitt's Baroque as an athletic art, and finally Schmarso's explanation as Baroque as a beauty of power, The debates in the German historiography of art of the 1880s and 90s offered a wide spectrum of interpretive approaches to the Baroque, slowly but constantly moving towards a positive, even enthusiastic attitude towards this style and its architecture. Thank you very much.
So thank you for this inspiring conference. We have to talk about it, but I think we should talk about it tomorrow, perhaps. Let's see. And we will continue with the conference of Gaspar Salomon, who comes from us, I don't know, from Budapest or from Leipzig, because they did not very because he studied history of art in Budapest. He is a PhD candidate at the Humboldt-Universität in Berlin with Kai Kappel, and research associate at the Leibniz Institute for History and Culture of Eastern Europe at the University of Leipzig. He has several research projects on history of art and architecture from the 19th and 20th centuries in Central and Eastern Europe, especially architectural historiography, mobility and training of architects, also very important. Architectural theory, museum representations of architecture, architectural settings as national and international exhibitions, and just publishing something about museums, villages of the late 19th century. And tonight he will speak to us about Maria Theresienstiel, architecture, historiography, and dynastic representation in Vienna, Budapest, around 1900. So,
thank you very much, Professor Klein, for the kind introduction, and many thanks to Professor Frommel and Professor Karge for organizing this great conference, and also for having me. It's an honor to speak here. From the late 1880s, several paradigmatic scholarly works came out contributing to the emancipation of European Baroque architecture in art historiography. The highly influential books of Heinrich Wölfflin, August Moiseau, and Cornelius Gurlitt opened up the purview of scholarship on architectural history, both in thematic and epistemological respect. Their novelty lay not merely in the fact that they regarded the Baroque as a legitimate subject of art historical inquiry, but that they offered new methods to deal with questions raised by the formal and spatial characteristics as well as specific tendencies of art historical development typical for this period. Nevertheless, this paradigmatic shift in the architectural historiography neither arose in a cultural vacuum, nor was confined to the close scholarly community of art historians. As the examples of major European capitals such as Berlin, Vienna, or Paris indicate, up to the late 1880s, the Baroque revival was already part of the everyday aesthetics and the public space. This reflected changes in taste, shifting social order and practices, as well as, for the present study, most importantly, emerging political visions. In the following, I will show how the so-called Maria Teresa style evolved as a concept of art historical scholarship, while gaining also a distinguished semantic charge in the political discourse in the twin capitals of Austria-Hungary, Vienna and Budapest. Perhaps nowhere else in Europe can be found the historiography of Baroque so intimately intertwined with the current political context in Vienna, as in Vienna. In the 1880s, the key figure in turning the art historical and critical discussion into a political one was Albert Ilg. As a number of studies have already pointed out, this somewhat Don Quixote-like character developed a highly effective strategy to propagate revivalism, relying on the Austrian Baroque of the late 70th and 80th centuries. This trained art historian combined scholarly methods to carry out in-depth research on Baroque art and architecture on the one hand, and deliberately biased and vehement rhetoric advocating the Baroque revival in Vienna on the other. In his famous pamphlet in 1880, entitled Die Zukunft des Barockstils, eine Kunstepistel, Ilk argues for re-establishing the Austrian Baroque tradition by referring to the artistic conjuncture under the great emperors from the Habsburg dynasty during the 17th and 18th centuries. As he says, quote, wäre es ein Unglück, wenn die Kunstblüte aus den Tagen Leopolds, Karls VI. Und der großen Theresa sich für uns erneuerte? Unquote. As it is apparent from this proclamation, Ilk saw a mutual interdependence between artistic performance, Kunstblüte, and the political program of Habsburg absolutism. However, Ilk's take implies more than reinforcing dynastic legitimacy by the Baroque revival. In fact, he provides a critical analysis of the geopolitics of Austrian art in the 19th century. Although recent studies on the Zukunft often disregard this fact, architecture was not the central concern of the pamphlet. Instead, it focused first and foremost on the development of arts and crafts in Austria. This was a reaction to the state of competition in the decorative arts industry in Europe, in which, according to Ilk's assessment, Austria was lagging far behind the great nations, most importantly, the rival France. In this way, Ilk not only suggested a stylistic reform of Viennese architecture, which indeed had mostly local impact, but also intended to boost the industrial production of crafts, which would have broadened the economic and cultural outreach of Austria to the rest of the world. Among Ilk's initiatives, the most successful were the ones aiming at the renewal of the so-called monumental architecture. Here, the art historian made clear which aesthetic qualities of the Austrian Baroque should have been revived in contemporary architecture. He traced back the substantial values and national characteristics of Austrian Baroque to the late 70th and early 18th centuries, or, if you follow his periodization, to the role of Leopold I and Karl VI. Quote, das österreichische Wesen ist die leibhaftige Barockfassade, lustig und frisch und immer lächelnd, nirgends langweilig. Voller Kapricen und guter Dinge, ein ganzes Nest von Überraschungen. End of quote. The art historian's vision contributed largely to the public perception of Baroque as well as to its increasing importance for the dynastic representation of the Habsburg. The latter is evident from how Neo-Baroque has become gradually the defining style of the extension of the Hofburg Palace and the adjacent cultural facilities in Vienna. For instance, one could mention the subsequent completion of the so-called Michaela tract, initially commissioned by Karl VI as a northeastern extension of the Hofburg. The accurate reconstruction, which was carried out some 150 years after the failure of Johann Bernhard Fischer for Erlach's original concept, made historical recourse to the golden age of the Habsburg dynasty. By the obvious intention behind the use of such architectural references to the imperial Baroque culture in the late 70th and early 18th centuries was to reinforce Habsburg authority, the period of Maria Theresa between 1740 and 1780 played a quite different role in the Viennese Baroque revival. The Maria Theresian style, as it was referred to by some authors of the time, was identified as a specific tendency of Rococo, limited mostly to the interior decoration, which distinguished it from the monumental exteriors of the preceding High Baroque. Parallel to the extension of the Michaela tract, another reconstruction project took place in the Hofburg, which turned the spotlight on the period of Maria Theresa. It was, again, Albert Ilk, who was directing the restoration of the Empress's bedroom between 1887 and 1895. The art historian got himself involved in the restoration project not only out of loyalty to the dynasty and the sake of Habsburg representation, but also because by the time Maria Theresa's period has already become a part of his scholarly interest. For instance, in the Kunstgeschichtliche Charakterbilder aus Österreich-Ungarn, a survey on Austrian art history published in 1893, Ilk authored two chapters, the one on Baroque and the one on Rococo. In the latter, Ilk, now in the capacity of academic art historian, raised concerns about oversimplified periodization, carefully refraining from explicitly terming the second half of the 18th century Maria Theresa style. Yet, in his work, the progressive artistic tendencies of this period, expressed primarily by the interior decoration, were linked to the new cultural, political and diplomatic developments under the Empress's rule, in particular to the intensive French cultural influence. Gut, in den Tagen Maria Theresias, in denen ja sogar auf der politischen Gebiete sich eine Kollision zwischen beiden Staaten angebahnt hatte, welche in der Thronbesteigung der Lieblingstochter der großen Kaiserin in Frankreich die Besicherung finden sollte, da strömte allerdings gallisches Wesen auch im Habsburgerreiche, wie auf jedem Felde des geistigen Lebens, so auch in den Künsten mächtig herein. By this, it implied that the era of Maria Theresa resulted in a harmonical and fruitful artistic exchange with a much more progressive France. As he later enhances, this cultural transfer was not only beneficial for the Austrian interior design, but it has also proved to be decisive in the development of arts and crafts in the monarchy. This scholarly account on the period might explain why it tended to involve the Maria Theresa style in the politically driven canon of Austrian Baroque, despite it was considered quote-unquote housewifely solid, as the contemporary Viennese critic Ludwig Heresche put it. On the one hand, for Ilk, interior design and art industry meant an integral part of a total Baroque aesthetics. On the other, by the revival of the Rococo style under Maria Theresa, he invoked a period in which Austrian achievements in the art industry appear on a pair with those of France. In this way, the Austrian art under Maria Theresa situated itself in a broad European context, in contrast to the High Baroque, which, as Werner Tedesco and other art historians already pointed out, represented the coherence of the multinational Habsburg Empire and hence served for domestic policy goals. The less discussed the Baroque period in the research on Hungarian architectural history during the 1880s was the more sensational. The historical main building group of the 1896 Budapest Millennial Exhibition appeared as it provided visual proof of the historical and aesthetic qualities of a long-time neglected style. The replicas of historic monuments occurring at the ephemeral pavilion of the National Fair highlighted not only the major periods of Hungarian architectural history, which already deserved considerable scholarly and public attention, such as the Romanesque, Gothic and Renaissance style, but also the Baroque. Two of the facades of the so-called Renaissance Baroque pavilion showed a montage of architectural details of eminent Baroque monuments in Hungary and several motifs alluding to the Viennese High Baroque from the turn of the 17th and 18th centuries. On the top of indicating the increasing recognition of the Baroque, the display revealed the concept of the Maria Theresa style, different as it was constructed in the Viennese discourse. Although the pavilion displayed almost exclusively examples of the High Baroque in the fashion of Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach, its description in the official catalogue of the historical main building group situates the peak of Baroque culture in Hungary in the period of Maria Theresa. More interestingly, further texts elaborating on Hungarian architectural history on this occasion link the High Baroque tradition with the Empress's rule. The art historian Péter Kerece distinguished two major periods of Baroque architecture in Hungary. Firstly, the one featured by the first representative buildings of the Counter-Reformation in northern Hungary in the 17th century. Secondly, the Maria Theresa style, which in the spirit of Fischer von Erlach was represented in Hungary mainly by the imperial architect Robert, in fact Franz Anton Hildebrand, who also built the royal palace of Buda. End of quote. This rather anachronistic linkage of Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach's High Baroque and Maria Theresa's rule, the Empress was enthroned some 70 years after the Viennese architect had already passed away, has become a topos in writings on Baroque in Hungary at the turn of the century. Most notably, the architectural style associated with the Habsburg Empress gained increasing importance during the neo-Baroque reconstruction of the royal castle in Buda. In addition to reshaping the skyline of the modernizing Hungarian capital, this flagship project taking place between 1891 and 1905, played a crucial part in the representation of the Habsburg dynasty. After the 1848 revolution and the oppression of subsequent struggles for freedom against the Viennese court, the Compromise of 1867 brought about reconciliation between the Hungarian elites and the Emperor Franz Joseph I. These positive changes in political relations were reflected by the rebuilt and substantially enlarged residence palace, as its style and motives unmistakably referred to the Habsburg period. In a lavish publication on the project, the leading architect Alois Hausmann explained the stylistic orientation and architectural iconography of his work, which culminated in the representative so-called Habsburg Saal. Quote, the palace, built in the Viennese Baroque style during the reign, here's the Habsburg Saal, during the reign of Maria Theresa, was ordered to be kept as a sign of piety, end of quote. In another passage on Habsburg Saal, he read, quote, the room is decorated with colorful marble tiling in the Baroque style of Fischer von Erlach. The marble statues of Habsburg emperors, including Maria Theresa, stand in the wall panels, end of quote. That Hausmann associated the Viennese architect style with the empress, anything but accidentally, is clear from one of the notes after a lecture he presented as a professor at the Technical University of Budapest around 1900. In his lecture, he refers to Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach explicitly, quote, as the founder of Maria Theresa style, end of quote. Thus, while Jung explicitly differentiated the Viennese Baroque from Rococo, by the building program of the Royal Palace, Hausmann suggested a continuity between the High Baroque of Fischer von Erlach and the rule of Maria Theresa, who contributed largely to the palace's construction in the second half of the 18th century. This dubious notion very likely has its explanation in the political context in which the fin de siècle reconstruction took place. In the eyes of many Hungarians, the historical legitimacy of the Habsburgs' authority over the Kingdom of Hungary was still questionable. At the same time, the Hungarian collective memory considered Maria Theresa's rule as a historical period of synergy between the Hungarian nation and the Habsburg court, as opposed to their ambivalent shared history. With this strategy, the architectural program of the Royal Palace found a way to assert the importance of the Habsburg dynasty in Hungarian history. As the prominent Hungarian historian Henrik characterized the empress in his 1891 published monograph, quote, the last young of Julie Habsburg was not merely a titular queen of Hungary. She describes herself as a true Hungarian. Her heart was full of noble gratitude to this nation. The Hungarians have again a loved emperor who appreciates them, end of quote. The politically motivated concept of the Maria Theresa style found neither in Austria nor in Hungary its way into a later, more systematic research on Baroque. However, it provides an eloquent illustration of the interplay between political machinery and art historiography at the turn of the century. In the Hungarian case, the notion of the Maria Theresa style did not emerge on scientific grounds. On the contrary, this politically driven and thus arbitrary concept filled the gap which has been left uncovered by architectural historiography. The style associated with Maria Theresa constituted a shared cultural environment to provide public recognition for the Habsburg dynasty and to facilitate Hungary's political integration in the dual monarchy. In Austria, and in Vienna, most importantly, the political art historiography of the Maria Theresa style encompassed a historical critical approach to the stylistic phenomenon. At the same time, it did not lose sight of the political goals and invoked the Maria Theresa style as a sign of the competitiveness of Austrian art on the international level. Hence, unlike the Hungarian semantics of the Maria Theresa style, which evolved from the internal diplomacy between Budapest and Vienna, Ilk's concept reflected ambitions at a wider geopolitical scale. Yet, instead of developing into an internationally influential domestic architectural style, the Maria Theresian style ended up as a reactionary alternative against the Viennese modernism after 1900. As the Austrian heir presumptive Franz Ferdinand's provocative remark to Otto Wagner, and the 1907 consecration of the modern St. Leopold am Steinhof Church illustrates, quote, der Maria Theresienstil ist doch der schönste. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you very much for this very interesting conference. I think there lacks a lot of research on neo-Baroque architecture, but so it's very important to have presented this to us. And now we come to our last conference for tonight from Peter Faraki, who is working in the Budapest Museum in Hungary, and he was his general director. He has 2 degrees in architecture and art history, and he has held some postdoctoral fellowships in Florence at the Villa Itati, in Cambridge, in Leipzig, and yes, in Washington, and he organized, that's important for us, the conference Italy and Hungary, Humanism and Art in the Early Renaissance at the Villa Itati some years ago, and also published, and he co-curated the Mattia Corvino e Firenze exhibition, which was held at the Museo di San Marco in Florence. His special research field is in the art of the Renaissance and Baroque, mainly the architecture and art patronage. And today, parla in inglese o in italiano?
Italiano.
Italiano. Allora, in italiano, la prima fioritura della storiografia ungherese dell'architettura.
Ringrazio il professor Bruno Klein per l'introduzione e anche vorrei ringraziare anche i professori Sabine Frommel e Henrik Karge per l'invito per questo convegno. La storia dell'arte come ramo della scienza si è manifestata in Ungheria non solo come parte di uno sviluppo universale, ma anche come scienza della nazione, la cui formazione maturò durante l'epoca delle riforme nel secondo quarto dell'Ottocento. In questo primo periodo la funzione della storia dell'architettura fu principalmente quella di fornire una base teorico-storica al restauro dei monumenti. I suoi 3 padri fondatori, Imre Hensman, Arnold Ipoi e Friedrich Frommel, furono tutti storici dell'arte autodidatti. Hensman era medico, mentre Frommel e Ipoi erano persone ecclesiastiche. Nei suoi 2 primi lavori teorici, Imre Hensman si rifece agli insegnamenti di Gustav Friedrich Wagen e Carl Friedrich Rumohr. A causa del suo coinvolgimento nella guerra di indipendenza anti-austriaca 1848-49, trascorse in esilio in Francia gli anni tra 52 e 60. Qui conobbe il lavoro di Viollet-le-Duc sulla teoria delle proporzioni nel gotico. Al suo ritorno in Ungheria effettuò importanti scavi medievali e dal 72 divenne docente della Commissione temporanea per i monumenti, poi professore di storia dell'arte all'Università di Brescia. Friedrich Frommel era un monaco benedettino, fondatore della collezione del ginnasio di Dieu e in seguito lavorò come custode della collezione numismatica e antichità del Museo Nazionale ungherese a Pest. I suoi scavi e le sue collezioni topografiche sono importanti e anche lui fu tra i responsabili della Commissione per il matrimonio monumentale. Arnold Ipoi, oltre alle sue opere topografiche, scrisse nel 1954 una mitologia ungherese. Come canonico e vescovo donò parte della sua considerevole collezione di opere d'arte alla Pinacoteca Nazionale e al Museo dell'arte cristiana di Esztergom. L'Ausgleich, compromesso del 1867 e la creazione dell'impero austro-ungarico condusse a tumultuosi cambiamenti anche nell'ambito dei musei, della protezione dei monumenti e dello studio della storia dell'arte in Ungheria. Nel 1972 fu istituito il Comitato Provvisorio dei Monumenti Ungheresi. Nel 1971 Arnoldo poi fondò la Pinacoteca Nazionale. Nel 1973 fu fondato il Museo di Arti Applicati e il Museo di Etnografia. Sempre nel 1973 fu istituito il Dipartimento di Storia dell'arte presso l'Università delle Scienze di Budapest sotto la guida di Imre Hensman. All'inizio del secolo XX la professionalità della disciplina della storia dell'arte poté rafforzarsi proprio grazie allo sviluppo del Dipartimento di Storia dell'arte dell'Università di Budapest. Gyula Pastener studiò filologia classica all'Università di Budapest, poi passò alla storia dell'arte presso l'Università di Vienna, dove seguì soprattutto le lezioni di Karl von Lützow. Dal 1975 divenne docente privato di storia dell'arte e nel 1990, dopo la morte di Hensman, fu nominato professore ordinario. Da allora fino al 1916 fu l'unico responsabile del Dipartimento e formò un'intera generazione di storici dell'arte ungheresi del XX secolo. Sappiamo molto poco delle sue lezioni. Si occupò di scultura greca e secondo una fonte sottolineo particolarmente gli aspetti storici, attaccando l'approccio estetico dei studiosi tedeschi come Winkelmann. Molto meno importante è la sua opera scientifica. Scrisse ad esempio sull'arte della città nei volumi intitolati La monarchia austro-ungarica attraverso le scritture ed immagini. Di particolare rilievo è il fatto che abbia anche contribuito con 800 articoli politici alla rivista clericale Magyarállam, lo Stato ungherese. Dal nostro punto di vista è interessante che sia stato il primo a richiamare l'attenzione sui monumenti dell'arte barocca ungherese. Nel 1896 scrisse uno studio sulle pitture murali del XVIII secolo. L'anziano Pastener, che nonostante il suo entusiasmo per l'impressionismo francese, diveniva via sempre più rigido nelle sue opinioni, fu collocato a riposo nel 1916 all'età di 70 anni e, sebbene l'offeso professore abbia continuato a tenere lezioni per 2 anni, questo periodo portò a un radicale cambio di guardia nel Dipartimento di Storia dell'arte dell'Università di Budapest. In seguito alla sconfitta della Prima Guerra Mondiale, alla disintegrazione della monarchia austro-ungarica e al Trattato di Versailles Trianon del 1920, il territorio dell'Ungheria storica si era notevolmente ridotto. Questo tragico cataclisma storico ebbe gravi conseguenze in tutti i settori della vita, compresa quello della storia dell'arte e della tutela dei monumenti storici. La rivoluzione democratico-borghese, cosiddetta dei crisantemi, alla fine di ottobre del 1980, portò alla detronizzazione della dinastia asburgica e alla proclamazione della Repubblica ungherese. Poi, sulla spinta della rivoluzione russa dall'ottobre 1917, nel marzo del 19, la rivoluzione proletaria sfociò nel governo della Repubblica Sovietica ungherese, che durò fino all'agosto dello stesso anno. Il dettaglio dei fatti storici è importante perché il pendolo degli eventi tornò a favore della controrivoluzione, il cui leader, l'ammiraglio Miklós Horthy, fu eletto governatore, ovvero capo di Stato del Regno senza re, il 1 marzo 1920. Il decennio tra 21 e 31, sotto la guida del primo ministro Conte István Bethlen, fu il periodo del consolidamento del sistema della destra controrivoluzionaria, della lotta ai gravi problemi economici e sociali, nonché della ricostruzione dei rapporti diplomatici con l'Europa. Verso la fine del secolo, a Budapest erano sorti vari circoli intellettuali progressisti e di sinistra, il Circolo della Domenica, la Scuola Libera delle Scienze Spirituali, intorno a figure quali György Lukács e Lajos Fülöp, il cui ulteriore funzionamento divenne impossibile nella nuova atmosfera conservatrice. La situazione fu esacerbata dalla legge sul numerus clausus del 20, che limitò l'accesso all'istruzione superiore ungherese delle minoranze nazionali, in primis delle persone di origine ebraica. Alcuni storici dell'arte di sinistra, che si occupavano principalmente di arte dell'Europa occidentale e si erano compromessi durante la Repubblica Sovietica ungherese, dovettero emigrare. Tra questi furono Frigyes Antal, Frederick Antal, Arnold Hauser, Károly o Charles de Tornai, Simon Meller, Jenő Lányi, János o Johannes Wilde, la maggior parte dei quali ebbe poi una carriera illustre in Europa occidentale e negli Stati Uniti. Il più importante politico della cultura ungherese del periodo tra le due guerre fu il conte Kuno Klebersberg, che ricoprì per 10 anni la carica di ministro della religione e dell'educazione. Suo obiettivo primario fu riportare il sistema ungherese delle istituzioni educative, di ricerca e culturali ai standard dell'Europa occidentale. Cerco di ottenere la supremazia culturale ungherese nei confronti degli stati confinanti nati in seguito alla dissoluzione dell'Ungheria storica. Fece costruire numerose scuole elementari nelle zone di provincia, circa 5.000. Rifondò a Szeged e a Pécs l'Università di Kolozsvár, oggi Cluj-Napoca, e Pozsony, oggi Bratislava, che si trovavano ormai negli ex territori ungheresi. Nel 22 ordinò la fusione in un solo istituto degli archivi nazionali, della Biblioteca Nazionale e dei 3 musei nazionali esistenti, creando la cosiddetta collezione universale nazionale ungherese. Klebersberg stesso dichiarò la sua preferenza per lo stile barocco. Nel suo libro 3 generazioni, lo storico Gyula Szekfű scrisse che la storia ungherese tra le 2 guerre mondiali fu caratterizzata dalla società neobarocca. L'epoca di Horthy, dunque, non guardo al liberalismo nobiliare della prima parte del XIX secolo o al liberalismo borghese radicale seguito all'Ausgleich, bensì all'epoca dell'impero asburgico del XVIII secolo, in particolare al regno di Maria Teresa. In seguito il trattato di pace Versailles, Trianon del 20, l'Ungheria aveva perduto l'area dell'Alta Ungheria, oggi Slovacchia, e della Transilvania, oggi parte di Romania, ricche di monumenti medievali. I 150 anni di occupazione turca, a partire dal tardo Medioevo, avevano distrutto gran parte dei monumenti medievali geograficamente situati nella parte centrale dell'Ungheria storica. Per questo fu naturale rivolgere maggiore attenzione ai monumenti barocchi che dominavano quella zona, essendovi sorti grazie alle ricostruzioni avvenute nel fine del 600 e nel 700. Inoltre, il regolamento sui monumenti storici del 1904 aveva spostato all'inizio del XIX secolo il limite cronologico della categoria dei monumenti da tutelare. Dagli anni 20 all'Università delle Scienze di Budapest esistevano 2 cattedre di storia dell'arte che rivaleggiavano seguendo metodi diversi e che riflettevano anche le tendenze politiche dominanti dell'Ungheria conservatrice e di destra tra le 2 guerre mondiali. Una era la cattedra guidata da Tibor Gerevic. Il nome, l'Istituto di Archeologia e Storia dell'Arte Cristiana, di orientamento italiano, è basata sulla critica dello stile, fondata nel 24. L'altra era la cattedra guidata da Antal Heckler, di orientamento tedesco, il nome, il Dipartimento di Archeologia Classica e Storia dell'Arte. Heckler, che era filologo classico, poi studioso di arte barocca, sposò insieme ai suoi studenti il metodo storico basato sulla ricerca delle fonti di archivio. Sebbene il progresso è evidente nello studio del periodo barocco ungherese, avvenne grazie al Heckler, Tibor Gerevic non si tirò indietro, quantomeno non all'inizio della sua carriera. Dopo aver completato gli studi all'Università di Budapest e poi il dottorato, trascorse 2 anni a Bologna, facendo ricerche sulla pittura di miniatura e sulla pittura rinascimentale e barocca bolognese, pubblicando i suoi risultati significativi nella rassegna d'arte. Nel suo studio sulla pittura bolognese del Trecento, sottolineando le influenze bizantine, polemizzò con Max Borchardt e Otto Wulf. Al congresso internazionale di storia dell'arte, tenutosi a Roma nel 1912, tenne una conferenza sulla pittura barocca ungherese. Tornato in Ungheria, dopo aver catalogato alcune importanti collezioni di pittura al Museo dell'arte cristiana di Esztergom e anche alla Galleria Czartoryski di Cracovia, nel 1916 fu nominato direttore del Museo cristiano di Esztergom. Lo caratterizzarono una sorprendente capacità di essere attivo in più luoghi contemporaneamente, nonché buone capacità di diplomatiche. Grazie a queste ultime ebbe buoni rapporti con Arduino Colasanti, che gli permisero nel 22 di ottenere dal governo italiano il villino fra lui a Roma. Nel 27 poi, con intervento personale di Mussolini, lo Stato ungherese acquistò sempre a Roma il Palazzo Falconieri, ristrutturato da Borromini, che divenne la sede dell'Accademia d'Ungheria e quindi la base principale per studiosi e artisti ungheresi che arrivarono in Italia con un borsa di studio. Gerevic, come leader della scena artistica, si ispirava all'arte neoclassica italiana del periodo e portò la cosiddetta scuola romana dell'arte ungherese, sulla scena internazionale grazie alla Biennale di Venezia ed ad altre mostre all'estero. Per il resto della sua carriera, tuttavia, si concentra sull'arte medievale dell'Ungheria storica e nel 1938 scrisse, tra l'altro, un'importante sintesi dell'arte romanica in Ungheria. A metà degli anni 30, inoltre, riorganizzò e rese più efficiente l'organizzazione ungherese per la tutela del patrimonio culturale. A differenza di Kerevic, che era un artista della vita, un iperattivo e che era a capo di diverse istituzioni, Enter Heckel era un personaggio completamente diverso. Aveva conseguito un dottorato in legge a Budapest e poi aveva studiato filologia classica con Wilhelm Furtwängler a Monaco, München. Al suo ritorno in patria, accanto agli incarichi museali a Budapest, all'inizio del 2017 fu nominato direttore dell'Istituto Ungherese delle Scienze di Costantinopoli, Istanbul, e dal 2018 divenne professore universitario di Storia dell'arte di Budapest. In qualità di responsabile della collezione di antichità del Museo di Belle Arti, organizzò la prima mostra permanente. Accanto alle importanti pubblicazioni sulla scultura greca antica, che abbandonò gradualmente per via dell'insegnamento, scrisse 2 riassunti della storia dell'arte ungherese, per poi occuparsi anche di argomenti barocchi, cambiando così l'indirizzo dei suoi studi. Nel dipartimento da lui diretto incoraggiò la stesura di tesi e dissertazioni sull'arte barocca, tanto che si poté osservare un notevole progresso delle ricerche in questo campo. I suoi talentuosi studenti scrissero una dopo l'altra monografie su alcuni dei più importanti monumenti barocchi ungheresi. János Kaposi conseguì il dottorato nel 1922 con una tesi intitolata La immagini del soffitto della cattedrale di Szombathely, pubblicata anche in forma di libro. Con essa offrì un eccellente esempio di studio complesso della decorazione della chiesa progettata da Melchior Hefele e decorata con dipinti murari di Franz Anton Maubach. Lavorò per tutta la vita presso l'Archivio Nazionale e svolse un'intensa attività di ricerca sulle fonti archivistiche in patria e anche a Vienna. I suoi saggi si concentrano sulle caratteristiche dell'architettura classicista, tardo-barocca, e i risultati sono quindi in parallelo con quelli di libro Spätbarocker und romantischer Klassizismus di Siegfried Gideon. Tuttavia, il suo approccio positivista, che si basava esclusivamente su fonti d'archivio, gli impedì di riassumere il suo vasto materiale in studi esaustivi e la sua eredità è costituita da un'enorme quantità di materiale di archivio. Andor Pigler studiò legge, storia dell'arte e archeologia all'Università di Budapest. Fu anche su incoraggiamento di Heckel che si dedicò alla ricerca barocca. Le sue 2 prime monografie, le pitture del soffitto della chiesa parrocchiale di Papa e la chiesa Sant'Ignazio e Dieu, e le pitture del suo soffitto 23 e 22, in cui si concentrava principalmente sulla decorazione delle pareti interne di 2 chiese barocche, rappresentano 2 pubblicazioni esemplari. In qualità di capo museologo del Museo di Belle Arti di Budapest, nonché poi quale direttore generale tra 1956 e 64, compilò il catalogo completo della Pinacoteca Vecchia. La sua opera principale è il più importante manuale di iconografia barocca universale, l'imponente opus baroque tema. Arnold Schön iniziò i suoi studi di storia dell'arte come novizio premontresense, poi per molti anni condusse come ricercatore indipendente. Massicce ricerche soprattutto sulle fonti di archivio riguardanti la storia dei monumenti barocchi di Budapest. Nel 1930 pubblicò due importanti monografie sul municipio centrale di Budapest, ex Palazzo dei Invalidi a Pest, e sulla ex gesuita chiesa parrocchiale di Sant'Anna a Buda. In seguito lavorò per la capitale, dapprima come supervisore dei monumenti pubblici, poi come direttore del Dipartimento Moderno del Museo di Budapest, Museo Kiscál. Nelle sue pubblicazioni ha ridefinito l'opera fino allora sconosciuta di molti maestri della perduta del XVIII secolo, tra cui anche italiani e austriaci, collocandola nel contesto dell'arte barocca europea. Ella mi riferì che iniziò come insegnante di disegno e solo in seguito si laureò alla facoltà di lettere, fu indirizzato verso il periodo barocco da Gyula Pasteiner. È stato un ricercatore dei maestri barocchi di Pest-Buda e di quelli della provincia, basandosi principalmente su fonti d'archivio, anche se il suo impulso lo spinse emotivamente alla creazione un po' azzardata di opere di più ampio respiro. Era più attivo presso il Dipartimento di Storia dell'Architettura del Politecnico di Budapest. La sua figura si conduce quindi all'attività svolta dagli architetti ungheresi, laureatisi al Politecnico tra le due guerre mondiali. In questo periodo osserviamo due tendenze principali. L'una rappresentata dai molti che lavorano in sincronia con l'architettura moderna europea, tra cui il gruppo ungherese Siam, i quali però ebbero poi pochi incarichi statali. Il governo infatti sosteneva l'altro filone, che seguiva il fenomeno ormai anacronistico dell'architettura storica, perpetuando così lo storicismo. Un suo rappresentante di spicco è stato l'architetto Gyula Werder, che in qualità di professore del Dipartimento di Antichità del Politecnico non solo insegnò, ma fu anche restauratore di diversi monumenti barocchi ed essere diversi edifici neobarocchi a Budapest in provincia. In conclusione, possiamo affermare che la svolta politica conservatrice tra le due guerre mondiali, il cosiddetto fenomeno sociale neobarocco, ha giocato un ruolo fondamentale in molti settori della cultura e della scienza. L'esplorazione dei fenomeni e della storia dell'arte barocca, così come l'applicazione materiale negli edifici che da quella conoscenza scaturiva, hanno determinato l'essenza delle ricerche storico-artistiche, ma anche una tendenza dell'architettura contemporanea finanziata anche dallo Stato. Grazie per l'attenzione.
Grazie. Anche da parte mia per questa conferenza con la quale siamo finalmente arrivati nel Novecento e anche nell'epoca moderna. Abbiamo un po' di tempo per una discussione? 5 minuti forse? Sì, allora 5 minuti e prego Ute e Gaspar di venire qui sul tavolo. E poi allora ci sono delle domande, some questions. I hope so. Yes, Sabine.
There's a question to Ute. Under which influences have been written? When I had a look to the descriptions of the Baroque of Goethe and Wolfram, you feel the influence of the opera, you feel the influence of Richard Wagner. And I wonder whether like perhaps Wagner, I remember that he evoked in another context also the last words of Tristan and Isolde. And I think this topic is highly interesting for our discussion. In which way the description and the perception, the vision of such a style has been influenced by other contemporary artists.
Yes, thank you. Yes, it's in fact in Renaissance and Baroque that he quotes these last words of Tristan, and it's about what I had one quotation where he talks about sort of paraphrased to lose yourself in eternity or in dem Unendlichen, verlieren in dem Unendlichen, and it's obviously it's a very complicated relation which. Wölfli, I can't say whether he liked Wagner or not, because my methodological approach was really not a biographical one, but one about the sort of what the writings, sort of the discourse, really of the writings themselves. So obviously he is struggling with this whole sort of, and of course there's also Nietzsche in the background. It's between the steel Dionysian and Apollonish. Yes, this is certainly true, and it's a path probably worth further to inquire how the experience of Wagner operas in action really shaped the view of this kind of architecture. But certainly the idea of certainly Wölfli had difficulty with this idea of losing, of this sort of force, obviously he felt in Baroque, especially interiors, to lose yourself into this Unendliche and this sort of eternity. Yes, but it's, yes, it's a complex relationship, and we could talk about this sort of go on, and I've got a chapter about this in the book as well, yes. Mm-hmm.
Other questions? Altre domande?
Another question for Ute. Sorry. But first of all, thank you very much for this super interesting close reading of those three very interesting, very diverse historians of Baroque architecture. And I was just wondering, during your extensive archaeology of art historic methodology, have you found anything that could be useful for art historians of the 21st century? Concepts, ideas, observations, whatsoever?
You can say answer yes or no.
It's not a question for us, yes and no. Yes. Yes, of course it's difficult because what I must say, what I really found fascinating, what I term this formal-analytische Debatte is debate formal analysis, and I think the way this was the way this debate went on was really on a very high intellectual level, and you certainly encounter very original thinkers. Wölfli, of course, is an original thinker. Schmarzo, to myself, so in my view, is a very original thinker, but he's sort of much underestimated because he's so complex. But you really have to get into this close reading and realize what he really is struggling with. And he changes his mind during his long life, and so he has different versions of the same problems. And yes, so I think this is something which is sort of challenging, because you think, well, it's interesting how they think about art, and they use this. They struggle with the differentiation between Renaissance and Baroque in order to develop their methodology, and this is still in the large part methodology which we use today, because of course not only the canon of the buildings which they choose, but in the concepts like Gesamtkunstwerk, which are sort of the synthesis of art, which of course has something to do with the opera question, of course, because the Gesamtkunstwerk is sort of the Wagnerian idea. So we still use it, and we still struggle with it. We suddenly look at the whole notion of the sort of national entities from a very different perspective. But this sort of more abstract thinking about art is sort of challenging and can be inspiring. But on the other hand, in my conclusion, when I sort of concluded thinking about this 100 years of writing art history, certainly this approach which does try to transfer visual impression into a language which is as original probably as some of these artworks about which they wrote. This is something which is inspiring too, because you see how much language matters. Yes.
So I see a last question, a last short question, and a last answer, please. And the rest we will do in the general discussion tomorrow.
Thank you. I have a question for our two speakers from Hungary. I was very much struck. I was very much struck with the figure of Aleš Hausmann, because he did a project for Palace of Governor in Rijeka, Fiume. So I'm quite curious whether there he also chooses the same style. Basically, he explained also his own personal expression, basically, although he's very much out of Hungarian context in that moment. And my question for Peter is also where you showed us very much how this Baroque legacy in Hungary was studied, but I'm curious when the Renaissance of Hungary actually entered the scene. Just very, very shortly. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. As a matter of fact, in the case of the Royal Palace of Budapest, the style was indicated by the construction history, the quite long construction history of the palace during the early modern period, and then the Baroque construction, and then it also helped Hausmann to find the Baroque style itself and to develop into a specific style for municipality buildings, which itself is not evident. And in the case of Trieste, to be honest, there is a publication on the Trieste palace. Fiume municipality palace, and there is no further explanation, or is not dwelling on this type question very much, and they didn't find any kind of traces on the question of architectural iconography or the questions of style as reinforcing the Hungarian authority through the Baroque. But for me, it seems to be quite obvious that there is some kind of connection. I couldn't really prove it by any or through any sources or something like that.
Okay, thank you. And Renaissance?
The research of Renaissance initiated also in this period by Johann Baruch, who was the first Greek researcher. He was also a student of Anton Heckler, and she stressed also the Italian orientation. She wrote the magic work of l'arte nel corte di Matteo Corvino, after the pattern of Malaguzzi Valeri, the corte di Lodovico di Moro, which was ready in 40s, then destroyed by the Second World War, and she redired after the Second World War and finally published in 1966.
Okay, thank you. So I think penso che siamo tutti un po' stanchi e così grazie a tutti e a tutti e I leave the stage to Henrik for last words, so please Henrik.
So thank you very much for all the inspiring talks today, and also to the moderators who were spontaneously disposed to guide us through the program.